The 1990s were a golden age for a specific type of film, the Gen X 20-something coming-of-age movie. Often dubbed slacker films, movies like Reality Bites, Clerks, Singles, Empire Records, and Before Sunrise captured the aimless, introspective spirit of a generation caught between the optimism of the baby boomers and the hyperconnectivity of millennials. These films offered a snapshot of young adults wrestling with identity, love, and purpose amid the backdrop of grunge music, coffee shops, and record stores. Yet by the mid-2000s, the genre seemed to vanish from mainstream cinema. What caused this downfall? Well, the answer lies in a combination of cultural shifts, economic changes, and transformations in the film industry itself. Growing up in the early 2000s, I was captivated by the slacker films of the 90s. These movies spoke to me as a malaise-ridden 20-something stuck in a 13-year-old boy's body in my own right, searching for meaning in a world that often felt quite directionless. It was like looking into my own future, or so I thought. The films like SubUrbia and Clerks made the experience of being a wandering young adult feel universal, as if the uncertainty and aimlessness of that stage of life were rites of passage rather than personal failings. In watching these films, I felt a kinship with the characters and their struggles. They captured a freedom that was both exhilarating and deeply uncertain, a freedom that now feels conspicuously absent in today's cinema. The promise of that freedom, much like the promise of prosperity for Gen X, seems to have been a double-edged sword, offering hope while ultimately feeling out of reach. These films shaped my understanding of adulthood and creativity, even as their absence today leaves me yearning for stories that once spoke so profoundly to that shared experience. And so I want to take some time to talk about the decline of the Gen X slacker movie.
You gotta kick it off with a killer to grab attention. Then you gotta take it up a notch. You don't want to blow your wad. Then you gotta cool it off a notch. There are a lot of rules.
When I think about Gen X slacker movies, I can't help but see them as so closely tied to the culture of the time. Many Gen Xers were born in the 70s, meaning that by the mid-90s, they were in their 20s, navigating life in much the same way the characters in these films did. Raised in the aftermath of the 1960s counterculture and during the economic stagnation of the late 70s and early 80s, they developed a reputation for being cynical, introspective, and a little disillusioned with societal norms. It's no wonder that slacker films came out of this generation. They reflected that mindset perfectly. The protagonists of these films were often aimless, like record store clerks or budding artists trying to make sense of the world, or philosophy majors trying to reconcile their ideals in a world that didn't seem to care. The 90s cultural scene was just the perfect backdrop for these stories. With grunge music dominating the airwaves, alternative subcultures emerging, and a growing rebellion against materialism, it felt right for movies like Slacker and Reality Bites to capture this sense of disaffection. The characters in these films weren't the polished, heroic types that we often see in movies. They were flawed, messy, and sometimes aimlessly drifting, but they felt so much more authentic because of it. These films didn't force their characters to quote-unquote find themselves or succeed in traditional ways. Instead, they embraced ambiguity, personal reflection, and the sometimes awkward beauty of human connection. A whole slew of movies from the 90s embodied this same spirit of youthful confusion, humor, and rebellion. Films like The Day Trippers, Singles, Clerks, Mallrats, Suburbia, Chasing Amy, Go, Empire Records, Before Sunrise, Kicking and Screaming, Swingers, SLC Punk, High Fidelity, Mike Leigh's Naked, Almost Famous, Pump Up the Volume, Party Girl, Heathers, Office Space, and Glory Days. The list goes on and on. They all explored similar themes. They each captured the essence of Generation X, whether it was trying to figure out what came next after school, dealing with relationships, or simply grappling with the uncertainty of life. These films felt real in a way that movies before them, frankly, hadn't. And they captured what it was like to be young and searching during a time when things weren't as certain as they seemed.
50 years from now, we're all going to be dead, and there'll be new people standing here, drinking beer, eating pizza, bitching and moaning about the price of Oreos, and they won't even know we were ever here. And then 50 years after that, those suckers will be dust and bones, and there'll be all these generations of suckers.
When I think about the decline of slacker films, one thing that really stands out to me is the shift in economic realities. The 1990s were a pretty stable time economically. With a booming economy and affordable housing, young adults had a little more freedom to explore who they were and what they wanted out of life without constantly worrying about money. But then the early 2000s hit, and we saw the dot-com bubble burst followed by the Great Recession. Suddenly there was economic instability, student loan debt was skyrocketing, and rents were climbing. It became harder for younger generations to have that kind of carefree, aimless lives that slacker films celebrated. I also noticed a change in societal expectations around this time. The rise of hustle culture and social media made young adults feel like they were expected to always be productive, on the grind, if you will. Instead of drifting through life or questioning their place in the universe like the protagonists of slacker films, young people were now supposed to be constantly working towards something, whether it was a career, a side hustle, or self-improvement. The slacker archetype just didn't fit with this new narrative, and the characters in films started to reflect that shift. Instead of aimless wandering, we got driven characters navigating their quarter-life crises with a more structured story of success and failure.
You know, there's a million fine-looking women in the world, dude, but they don't all bring you lasagna at work. Most of them just cheat on you.
He's right. I love her.
When the slacker genre started to fade, I think its essence stuck around in different ways. For example, the early 2000s saw the rise of stoner comedies like Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle and Pineapple Express. They still had that irreverence and aimlessness that made slacker films so appealing, but they were also way more absurd, taking the humor to new, out-there levels. Then there were the man-child comedies like Step Brothers and Talladega Nights, which took the idea of Arrested Development and turned it into something larger than life, almost cartoonish. And indie films also went through their own evolution. Filmmakers like Noah Baumbach made Frances Ha and Greenberg, and Greta Gerwig made Mistress America, and they kept exploring themes of identity and purpose, but their films often feel more niche, aimed at art house audiences rather than the mainstream. Even Richard Linklater, who's synonymous with slacker films, moved into different directions. He made films like Boyhood and Everybody Wants Some, which explored similar themes, but did so in a broader way, focusing on the bigger picture of growing up and figuring out life.
Dolphin. And my friend Emma had a big crush on him. So one day I was cutting, across the field back to my room, and he came walking up beside me. And I told him, you should date Emma because she has a big crush on you. And he turned to me and said, well, that's too bad, because I have a big crush on you.
One of the reasons these slacker films faded away, I think, is that their settings and subcultures don't really exist anymore. Record stores, video rental shops, indie coffee houses, those were the backdrops where so much of this world played out. But now, streaming platforms and the internet have replaced them. The way we consume culture has completely shifted, and with it, those physical spaces that made these films feel so alive have mostly vanished. I can't help but feel like something's been lost in the process. Those analog hangouts weren't just places to buy stuff, they were places where people connected, argued about their favorite bands, or bonded over the shared love of a random cult movie. That kind of environment made these stories feel grounded and relatable. And watching those films now almost feels like stepping into a time capsule.
I sold term papers to make a living, slept with undergraduates, the whole deal. After my 7th or 8th year, I began to feel like I was using myself. Somehow I experienced my time as a postponement of my life, but eventually I just realized that this is my life.
One thing I've always wrestled with when it comes to Gen X slacker films is how often they feel a little too impressed with themselves. Now, don't get me wrong, there's something deeply relatable about characters questioning their place in the world, waxing poetic about life and love while hanging out in a record store. But sometimes, I can't help but feel like these movies lean too hard into their own sense of importance. The characters tend to be these hyper-verbal, overeducated types who drop philosophical references at the drop of a hat. They're cool, sure, but also kind of exhausting. There's a particular trope that I've noticed in these films that always makes me cringe. A college-educated character who looks down on someone with a lesser job, like a convenience store clerk or a fast food worker. And meanwhile, the same clerk is often the secretly wise, emotionally grounded one. It's like the films want to have it both ways. They critique elitism, but still make the intellectual the star of the show. It's as if they're saying, yeah, we know this guy's a jerk, but isn't he clever? It's a dynamic that could feel more smug than self-aware. I don't think this makes these films bad by any means, but it's definitely a part of them that hasn't aged as gracefully. For a genre that's all about authenticity and connection, there's something ironic about how often these movies seem to talk down to their audience. The characters' long-winded monologues about the real problems of their time can feel a little performative, like they're more interested in proving how deep they are than in actually connecting with the world around them. And looking back, I wonder if this pretentious streak is part of why the slacker film faded out. Maybe people got tired of characters who seem so convinced of their own brilliance while not really doing much of anything. Today, audiences seem to crave stories that feel more down to earth, more focused on connection than pontification. That's not to say these movies didn't have their moments. I still love Clerks and Reality Bites, but sometimes, watching them now, I catch myself rolling my eyes at how much smarter they think they are than everyone else in the room.
It matters because it happened to me. That was my story. I told that story a year ago, man. Oh, no. The difference is I knew those small but important details. That and my story was true.
Oh.
Whatever. Whatever?
Whatever.
What you mean, whatever?
Now, why don't you pull your stinky dinky out my ass? I'm trying to make conversation.
Another big reason these films disappeared is the way Hollywood has changed. Studios don't really make mid-budget movies anymore. The kinds that aren't flashy blockbusters, but also aren't indie darlings made on a shoestring budget. Slacker films thrived in that middle ground. They were small enough to take risks, but big enough to feel like cultural moments. Now, someone could get the sense that everything has to be part of a franchise or tied to some massive intellectual property. And sure, streaming platforms are giving space to smaller, introspective stories, but they just don't seem to resonate the same way. Maybe it's because they're so scattered, released quietly without the kind of communal fanfare and buzz that these slacker films used to generate.
You see, lady, this is all we need. A couple of smokes, a cup of coffee, and a little bit of conversation.
Even though the slacker movie isn't what it used to be, I think its spirit still shows up in modern films and shows. Movies like Frances Ha, Adventureland, or The Worst Person in the World remind me of the introspection and honesty that made slacker films so great, even if they're dressed up in more modern style. I also see it in shows like High Maintenance or Master of None or English Teacher. They capture that same feeling of being a little lost, trying to figure out what life is all about. It's like the slacker ethos has evolved for the streaming era. But I'll be honest, I miss the originals. There was something raw and unapologetic about those 90s films. They made it feel okay to be aimless and imperfect. Watching them now, I can see how much they shape the way I think about life, especially as I'm approaching the ripe old age of 30. And maybe they didn't have all the answers, but that was kind of the point.
That was the final irony, I think. That, well, this. Fuck you if you're already thinking it. I guess when all was said and done, I was nothing more than a goddamn trendy-ass poser.
The Gen X slacker movie was a product of its time, reflecting the cultural, economic, and societal conditions of the 1990s. As these conditions changed, so too did the stories we told about young adulthood. While the genre may no longer dominate the cinematic landscape, its influence can still be felt in character-driven narratives and introspective storytelling. In an era of hustle culture and relentless connectivity, perhaps it's worth revisiting these films to remember the value of ambiguity, reflection, and simply being. The slacker movie may be gone, but in my opinion, its legacy endures. That's going to do it for me on this video. I had a lot of fun working on this. I absolutely adore slacker movies. They were a big part of my life growing up. I hope that if you clicked on this, you are also interested in the subject and in these movies as well. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on why you think the slacker movie has maybe died out since, I guess I would say, the year 2000, 2001. It seems like they kind of just disappeared, like poof. And I want to know why. Let me know down in the comments. And after you do that, go ahead, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell to be notified when new videos come out on this channel. Go ahead and follow me on Letterboxd. Go ahead and check out my podcast, and I will see you all next time.